Good day, everybody, and welcome once again to our YouTube channel. Thanks for subscribing to our channel. We really appreciate it. Today we'll be talking about another topic as a continuation of one of our previous sessions. In one of our previous sessions, we talked about tissues and supporting systems. And in that topic, we talked about mammalian skeleton briefly. So today we'll be looking closely into mammalian skeleton. Today the topic we have before us is mammalian skeleton. So what is mammalian skeleton? First, we'll be discussing the skeleton. So the skeleton, like we have said in the previous class, we said that skeleton is a rigid framework that gives support, shape, protection, as well as rigidity to the body of an organism. Again, I said that skeleton is a rigid framework that gives support, shape, protection to the body of an organism. So we're talking about skeleton here. Skeleton. We said is a rigid framework. A rigid framework that gives one. It gives shape. 2. It gives support. 3. It gives protection to the body of an organism. To the body of an organism. So that is what skeleton is about. That it gives shape, rigidity, support, and protection to the body of an organism. So when we have an organism, the reason why the organism has a specific shape and it has the ability to support the organs inside of it and to also protect these internal organs is as a result of the skeleton that organism possesses. So we'll be looking closely into the classification of what skeleton is about. The classification of the mammalian skeleton. Classification of the skeleton. So before we go into that, I need us to understand that the skeleton, like we have said, is a rigid framework and it has a whole lot number of bones that makes up the skeleton. There are a number of bones that make up the skeleton. From infants, we have about 300 bones that are found in the infants, in the newborns. Just about 300, about an average of 300 bones are found in the infants. And by the time the infants get mature to the adult stage, the bones must have shrinked or must have joined together to form a total of about 206 bones. So what we're saying in essence is that in the infants we have about 300 bones. Infants. In infants, there are about 300 bones that fuse together to form an average of 206 bones. 206 bones in the adult human. So that is what we refer to as the skeleton, and like the number of bones that we have in the mammalian skeleton. So in the infant, we have an average of 300 bones, which eventually fuse up as the child or as the infant grows older. The bones fuse up to form or to give an average of 206 bones in total. As we move further, I will be able to tell you how some of these bones are dispersed across the body. So the first classification we'll be looking at is the axial skeleton. But before we go into that, let's just quickly see what the mammalian skeleton looks like. Alright, so this is what the mammalian skeleton looks like. As you can see, we have a whole lot of bones making up the mammalian skeleton. This is what we are seeing here. Everything we are seeing here is the mammalian skeleton, right from the head here to the arms, the upper limbs, we have the lower limbs, and they all make up what we refer to as the mammalian skeleton. So we'll be looking closely into this classification. So the first classification that we'll be looking at is the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton. The axial skeleton. Axial skeleton. That is the first classification that we'll be looking at. Axial skeleton. So what is the axial skeleton? Actually, we have two classifications here. We have the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So we'll be starting with the axial skeleton. So what is the axial skeleton? What do we refer to as the axial skeleton? The axial skeleton makes up the following. One, we have the bones of the skull. The skull, or we can refer to it as the bone of the head. Bone of the head. Two, we have the vertebral column. Two, we have the vertebral column. Three, we have the ribs. Four, we have the sternum, or in some textbooks we call them the breastbone or chest bone. Breast bone. This vertebral column can also be referred to as the backbone. And then we have let's call this one the fifth one, the rib cage. The rib cage. Now it is the ribs, the vertebral column, the ribs and the sternum that articulates together to form the rib cage. So when we look at the axial skeleton, what we're actually talking about is one, the skull, the vertebral column or the backbone, the ribs, the sternum, and then the rib cage. So here, let me quickly show us what the rib cage or the axial skeleton looks like. So when we look at this picture here, all of these parts here that you can see, the parts that are colored yellow, all of these parts showing the skull, the chest region where you can see the ribs, the sternum in the middle here. We have the ribs, you can see the ribs on the sides of the sternum, as well as this other vertebral column in the lower abdomen here. Those are the parts that make up the axial skeleton. Like I said earlier on, we mentioned the skull, we mentioned the sternum, the ribs, articulating together to form the rib cage, as well as the vertebral column. So all of those parts are the parts that make up the axial skeleton. So that is the first part or the first classification of the axial skeleton. That is the first part, the first classification of the skeleton as it is. So let us quickly look at the second classification. The second classification. Number 2, we have the appendicular skeleton. First, I just want us to get familiarized or to familiarize ourselves with the parts of each of these skeleton, so we then go further to discuss comprehensively what the parts of this skeleton are made of. So the appendicular skeleton comprises of the limbs. It comprises of the limbs as well as the limb girdles. It comprises of one, the appendicular skeleton comprises of the following. We have one, we have the limbs, and then we have the girdles. So there are two types of girdle here. We have the pectoral, we have the pectoral girdle, we have the pectoral girdle, we also have the pelvic girdle. So these are the girdles that we have. We have the limbs and then the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle forms the forelimbs, while the pelvic girdle forms the hind limbs. So those are the two major classifications of the mammalian skeleton, or of the human skeleton as the case is. So let's dive in fully to explaining what each of these type of skeleton is. So before I do that, let me quickly show us what the picture of the appendicular skeleton is. Alright, so here we have the picture of the appendicular skeleton. All of these parts that you can see colored in light red, or let's say pink, they make up the appendicular skeleton. If you look at this part here, you see something in the neck region here, that is the clavicle, and at the back of the ribs here, if you look closely, let me use this so you understand what I'm saying. Alright, if you look closely here, this part here that forms the limbs, the upper arm, that is all of the part that is colored in pink, or let's say light red, here and here, you will notice that those are the parts that are in the appendicular skeleton. Here in the upper neck here, we have something called the clavicle, like you can see here, and at the back of the ribs here, if you look closely, you will notice that there is a flat plate there, and that flat plate is called the scapula. They make up the shoulder girdle or the pectoral girdle. And then we have the upper limbs here, that's the forearms. And then looking at the lower part of the body here, we have this part here called the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle in the hip. And then we have the lower limbs that make up the legs. So those are the parts that are formed, or that make up the appendicular skeleton. So now let us look into the skull, or let us start with explaining the axial skeleton. Axial skeleton proper now. Axial skeleton. So like we have listed earlier on, the axial skeleton includes, we have the skull, we have the vertebral column, we have the ribs, the sternum that articulates to form the rib cage. So we want to pick it from discussing what the skull is. The skull. So what is the skull? Skull. The skull is the human head bone. The bone in the head is what we refer to as the skull. The skull has, or is divided into three. The skull is divided into three. The skull is divided into three. The skull bones are divided into three. We have the first one, which is referred to as the cranium. The cranium. The cranium, or in some textbooks you can see it as the brain box. The brain box. That is actually the part of the skull that houses the brain. That is its own function. It encloses the brain inside of it, preventing the brain from what? Having a confrontation, or having an impact with other parts of the skeleton. Inside the cranial box, or the cranium, there is a fluid that envelopes the brain, preventing it from having an impact on, or preventing the cranium from having an impact on the brain. So the fluid serves a cushioning effect, preventing the bone of the skull from crushing the brain. And then we have the second bone of the skull, called the facial skeleton. The facial skeleton. These are some parts of the bones that make up the bones of the face, like the bones that hold the nose, the eyes, the muscles of the neck. This part of the neck, of the face, or of the head, make up the facial skeleton. Again, I said the bones that make up the nose, that hold the nose, the eyes, and the muscles of the neck, they all make up the facial skeleton. And thirdly, we have the jaws. The jaws. So these jaws, they are two in number. We have the upper jaw and the lower jaw. The upper jaw and the lower jaw. So the upper jaw is also called the maxillae. The upper jaw is also called the maxillae, and the lower jaw is called the mandible. So this is what we are talking about. This is what the skull looks like. Now if you look at this part of the head, this is the shape of the skull of the head, the skull or the bone of the head. Now this region here houses the brain. So let me try to show you something that you'll understand better. All right, so let's look at this picture. Let's look closely at this picture. This part of the head. So this part here is where we have the cranium. That is what houses the brain. In the region here is where we have the brain box. And then if you look at this part here, we have the frontal bone. The bones here, they make up the frontal bone. That is the part that houses the nose. It houses the nose, the eyes, and the rest of those. And here we have, what I'm saying is, in this part of the head, we have the brain box. This part here, we have the brain box, and in this place here, that is where we have the facial bones. Are we together? The facial bones that houses the eyes, the nose, the cheekbone, and the rest of those. And then here we have the upper jaw called the maxillae, and underneath here we have the lower jaw called the mandible. So here, this part here that has the facial bone, the bones that houses the eyes, the nose, the jaws, the upper cheek, let's put it that way, they are called they make up the part of the facial bone, the facial skeleton. And then underneath here we have the jaws, the upper jaw, which is also called the maxillae, and the lower jaw, which is called the mandible. So those are parts of the axial skeleton. Those are part of the axial skeleton. So like we listed earlier on, that I said that we have a total of about 206 bones in the human, the adult human. So in the head, in the axial skeleton, the skull alone, we have about 8 cranial bones, about 8 bones here. So let me just put this here so we will get it, the number of bones. Here we have about 8 cranial bones, and then for the facial bones, the facial skeleton, we have about 14 of them. And then for the jaws and other parts of the body, okay, the facial skeleton and the jaws, for there 14. And then we have some auditory bones, make about 6, and about about that. So in the skull alone, we have over or close to 30 parts of the bones in the skull alone. So that is that about the skull. Let us try and see what happens in the vertebral column. That is the second part of the axial skeleton that we'll be talking about now. The vertebral column. So what makes up the vertebral column, or what do we refer to as the vertebral column? The vertebral column is a part of the axial skeleton that has a collection of bones called vertebrae. It has a collection of bones called vertebrae. It is made up of 5. It is made up of 5 It is made up of 5 sets of bones. 5 sets of bones called the vertebrae. Called the vertebrae. They make up the vertebral column. And between these vertebrae, the vertebrae are joined. The vertebrae are joined end to end by a plate called the cartilage. If you remember, in one of our previous sessions we talked about bones and cartilages as part of the things that make up the supporting tissues. So the cartilage is found in between the disc of the bone of the vertebral column. The cartilage is found there. So this is what the bone of the vertebra looks like. This is the vertebral column. This is what we refer to as the vertebral column. You can see it starting from the neck. We have the neck bones, we have the ones in the chest region till it gets to the hip region. So those are the things that make up the vertebral column. So let us quickly look at what these 5 sets of bones are. The 5 sets of bones. The 5 sets of vertebrae. The 5 sets of vertebrae. So I will be listing them with a reference to the number of bones that we have in each of the classes. So the first one, okay, let me put it this way. Let's quickly list them, and I will be talking about their number in various organisms, but remember that the particular one we're talking about is in mammals. So types of bones, types of vertebrae. And then we have location, and then we have those found in, let me give this a little space, the rabbits, the rats, and in humans. So let's see. We have the number of bones in the rabbits, the rats, and in humans. So that is what we'll quickly be looking at right now. So the first one, the first bone is called the cervical vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae. Now this cervical vertebrae is of 2 types. It is found in the neck. It's found in the neck, and it has, in the rabbit, it has a total of 7. In the rats, it has a total of 7, and in human, it also has a total of 7. Like I said, it is made of 2 bones. The first one, we have, let me put this way. A, we have the atlas, and B, we have the axis. The atlas and the axis. Those are the bones of the cervical. You have atlas and the axis. They are both found in the neck region, and this is the number that we have in human. For example, the atlas is 2 and the axis is 5 in humans. So let me put it this way, 2 and 5 to make a total of 7. This is the 7 that we now have here. So that is how we have it in the cervical vertebrae. And then we have the second one called the thoracic vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae. Now this thoracic vertebrae is found in the chest region. The thoracic vertebrae is found in the chest region, and in the rabbits we have it to be a total of let's say between 12 and 13 bones. The number of vertebrae for the thoracic region of the rabbits is about 12 to 13. In the rats, it is a total of 13. And in humans, it is a total of 12. Like you can see in the diagram shown here. If you look at this part here, we can see that the cervical, this is the part that is colored yellow. The part that is colored yellow, you can see if you look closely, you can see that it has C1, C2, C3, C4, C5, C6, and C7. So that is telling us that the cervical vertebrae is a total of 7. So we have C showing or identifying cervical. So C1 to C7 make up the cervical vertebrae, the cervical region of the vertebral column. So we made mention of the thoracic vertebrae as well, and we said that the thoracic vertebrae comprises of 12 bones in humans. So if you look at it, it is labeled T1 to T12, and that is what we have as what the thoracic vertebrae. Look at it from this part here, which where we have the purple color, or is it lilac color. So we have a total of 12 bones in this region here between T1 and T12. They all make up the thoracic region of the vertebral column. So the third bone now, the third bone is called the lumbar vertebrae. The lumbar vertebrae. So the lumbar vertebrae is found in the upper abdomen. The lumbar vertebrae is found in the upper abdomen. And in the rabbits, it is between 6 and 7. In the rat, it is a total of 6, and in humans, it is a total of 5 bones. It is found in the upper abdomen, like we can see here. This part that has blue color is the lumbar region of the vertebral column. The lumbar region of the vertebral column, and it has L1 to L5, telling us that the lumbar bones are 5 in number, and they are found in the upper abdomen. And then we have the fourth one to be the sacral vertebra. The sacral now. Sacral vertebrae. Sacral vertebrae. So the sacral vertebrae has a total, it is found, the location it is found in the lower abdomen. The sacral bones are found in the lower abdomen, and in the rabbit it is between 3 to 4. In the rats it has a total of 4, and in humans it has a total of 5. And then the last bone is the caudal vertebrae. The caudal vertebrae. So if you look at that region as well, it is found in the tail region. We call it the tailbone. The caudal bones are called the tailbone. It is found in the tail region, and in the rabbit it is a total of 16. In rat it is a total of, let's say, found to be between 27 and 30, and in humans it is a total of 4. So if we look at the total of all of those bones in each of the organisms, we will find out that in man, let's do it this way. We will find out that we have a total of 44 to 47. 44 to 47 in the rabbits. We have 57 to 50, 57 to 60 in the rats, and then 33 bones in the humans. That is how we have it. So in the rabbits we have a total of 44 to 47 bones. In the rats we have a total of 57 to 60 bones, and in humans we have a total of 33 bones. So let me quickly show us what the sacral vertebrae and the caudal bones look like. If you look closely here, we have the brown colored vertebrae. The brown colored vertebrae here, they make up this part here. They make up the sacral region of the vertebrae. We call them the sacral bones, or the sacrum. So we have a total of 5. If you look closely, you see that we have S1, S2, S3, S4 till we have what? S5. Those are the sacral bones. And then this green region here shows the coccyx, or the tail bones. So we have them to be the caudal bones, which is C1, C2, CO1, CO2, 3, and 4. So they make up the caudal bone, or the coccyx. Are we together? So those are, these are the sets of bones that we have on the vertebral column. They make up the vertebral column. So now we need to understand that some of these bones have specific functions. Some of these bones have specific functions, like the bones that are found in the neck, the neck bones, the atlas. Let's quickly look at this. The atlas. Functions of some of the vertebrae. Functions of some of the vertebrae. Now, we talked about the functions of the skeletal system or the skeleton in one of our previous classes. So today we just want to quickly shed some light on the functions of some of the bones. So let's talk about the atlas. The atlas is responsible for the ability of our the atlas is responsible for the nodding movement of the head. The atlas is responsible for nodding, while the axis is responsible for the rotational movement of the head or of the skull on the neck. The rotational movement of the skull. So those are the functions of the bones of the neck, the atlas and the axis. And then the thoracic bones, the thoracic vertebrae forms the rib cage. They form the rib cage. Then we have the lumbar, the sacral forming the abdominal bones. So as we said that the atlas is responsible for the nodding, axis is responsible for the thoracic, the axis is responsible for rotational movement of the skull. Then the thoracic vertebrae, they form the rib cage. So that is that about the function of, or some of the functions of these vertebrae. So we'll be moving to the next okay, before we go to that, we will talk about the characteristics of various vertebral bones. We'll talk about the characteristics of the various vertebrae. So that is what we will be talking about now. So let's quickly start with the cervical vertebrae. We're talking about the characteristics now. So the cervical vertebrae, we just take a few characteristics of each of the various vertebrae. So we're starting with the first one, which is the cervical vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae. That's the first one we'll be talking about. So we'll just pick a few characteristics of this particular vertebrae. So the first characteristic we'll be looking at, the first characteristic we'll be talking about in this cervical vertebrae is going to be about the centrum. So the cervical vertebrae has very relatively small centrum. It has relatively small centrum. Now, I need us to understand this, that the first atlas has no centrum. The first atlas, remember that we said that the cervical vertebrae is divided into two, this atlas and the axis. So the first cervical, which is the first atlas, has no centrum. It has no centrum, so that is one of the characteristics of the cervical vertebrae. The atlas, the first atlas has no centrum, while other vertebrae, other cervical vertebrae have relatively small, other cervical vertebrae have relatively small centrum. They have relatively small centrum. So that is one of the characteristics of the cervical vertebrae. Then the next characteristic we'll be talking about is the fact that these vertebrae have neural spine, which is short. The neural spine is short. The neural spine is short. The neural spine across the cervical vertebrae is short, and then they have relatively large neural canal. They have relatively large neural canal. Relatively large neural canal. So these are some of the characteristics of the cervical. Okay, let me add this one, that the cervical ribs are present. They have cervical ribs which are flattened transverse processes. So let's quickly add that they have cervical ribs present. Cervical ribs are present. Cervical ribs are present. So those are some of the characteristics of the cervical vertebrae. Characteristics of the cervical vertebrae. Then let me say this, that the axis now, the axis, okay, let me add this as the fifth one. The axis has odontoid process. The axis has odontoid process that fits into the neural canal. That fits into the neural canal. It fits into the neural canal of the atlas. And the function of that particular part, that's the odontoid process. The function is to allow the free rotational movement of the head. To allow free rotational movement. Free rotational movement of the head. So that is the reason why the head is able to have that rotational movement that it has. It's because of the odontoid process that is possessed by the axis in the cervical vertebrae. So these are some of the characteristics of the cervical vertebrae. Let us quickly take the characteristics of the thoracic vertebrae. So for the thoracic vertebrae now, thoracic vertebrae. For the thoracic vertebrae, we have this. We have this as the first characteristic. One, that they have long neural spine. They possess long neural spine. This particular vertebrae has long neural spine as well as large centrum. That's large centrum for articulation with the facets. And number 3, it has a pair of short transverse process. A pair of short transverse process. A pair of short transverse process, and that there is large neural canal and neural arch. Also the presence of large neural canal and neural arc. So these are some of the characteristics of the thoracic vertebrae. Now, I need us to understand that it is the thoracic vertebrae that articulates with the ribs. Note, the thoracic vertebrae. The thoracic vertebrae helps in the articulation. Of the ribs. It helps in the articulation of the ribs, as well as assisting in breathing alongside the ribs, as well as assisting in breathing. So what we are saying in essence is, it is the function of the thoracic vertebrae. As it helps to articulate with the ribs, it makes it possible for the ribs to have what we refer to as the rib cage, and the continuous contraction and relaxation of the rib cage is what brings about breathing as it is. So those are the characteristics of the thoracic region of the vertebrae. Let us take the third one, which is the lumbar vertebrae. The lumbar vertebrae. So for the lumbar vertebrae, we have the characteristics to be as follows. 1. The characteristics are as follows. 1. It has centrum which is very, very thick. The centrum in the lumbar vertebrae is thick. And then 2, we have the neural spine to be very short. The neural spine is short. And 3, the transverse process are long and broad. Transverse process is long and short. 4, that it has well developed pre and post zygapophysis. It has very well developed pre and post zygapophysis. So those are the characteristics. Okay, let me put that here. Well developed pre and post zygapophysis. So those are the characteristics of the lumbar vertebrae. And then we have the sacral, which is the fourth bone. We have the sacral, which is the fourth bone, having its own characteristics listed thus. The characteristics of the sacral bones, the sacral vertebra. Sacral vertebra. So the characteristics are listed as follows. 1, we have the bones that are fused together to form the sacrum. Bones fusing together to form the sacrum. And then 2, it possesses large centrum. Large centrum is present. Large centrum present. 3, coming. Large centrum present. 3, it has reduced neural spine. Reduced neural spine. Reduced neural spine. And then the narrow canal is as well very narrow. 4, narrow neural canal. So these are the characteristics of the sacral vertebrae. And the 5th one, which is the caudal. The caudal has the following vertebrae. Okay, let me quickly say this, that it is, okay, let me quickly put that before we move to the next. It is the function. We have the pelvic girdle, providing or like we said earlier on, that bones of the sacrum, they fuse together, the bones of the sacral vertebrae fuse together to form the sacrum. So we have this, that it is these bones that make up the pelvic girdle. They are joined to the pelvic girdle to provide support, rigidity, as well as strength. So it is the fusion of these bones that bring about that particular characteristic, making the sacrum to be the way it is. So the 5th bone that we're going to be talking about now is the caudal bone, the caudal vertebrae. So in the caudal vertebrae, we have its own characteristics going thus. 1, the entire bones consist of the centrum. The entire bones consists of the centrum. And then it has no neural canal. Absence of neural canal. 3, it also has no neural arch or neural spine. Absence of neural arch and neural spine, neural arch or neural spine. So these are some of the characteristics of the caudal vertebrae. Okay, let me put this, that in man, the bones are 4. In man, the bones are 4 in number, and they fuse together fusing together to form the coccyx. So they fuse together to form the coccyx. So that is what gives us the tail bones. So the caudal vertebrae support the tail and provides attachment for the tail muscle. So that is what we have for the characteristics of the vertebrae. So if we look closely here, this is how some of the vertebrae look. Here we have the cervical vertebrae, and this we have the atlas and the axis, and then we have the thoracic vertebrae here. Okay, let me use the pointer so you get me right. Here we have the cervical vertebrae. It is found in the neck region, and we have the atlas and the axis shown here. And then here we have the thoracic vertebrae. This is the thoracic vertebrae. And here we have the lumbar. We have the lumbar here. We have the caudal as well as the sacral in that picture that we are seeing. So that is that. So the next thing we shall be talking about now is going to be the ribs. Remember that we made mention of the ribs as part of the axial skeleton. So we've talked about the skull, we've talked about the vertebral column, so we're going to be talking about the ribs now. So the ribs form the rib cage. So that is where we're actually going now. So the rib is a curved bone. The rib is a curved bone on dorsal side of the ribs. On the dorsal side of the rib head. On the dorsal side of the rib head, called the capitulum. Now, the ribs are responsible for making that enclosure that we have in the chest cavity and the thoracic cavity that encloses all of the organs that we have inside the body. The organs that, like the heart, the liver, the lungs, as well as the intestinal walls. So it is the function of the ribs to have that curved shape so that it can enclose these internal organs. In man, we have a total of 12 ribs as it is seen in the thoracic region. If you remember that we said the thoracic cavity has a total of 12 ribs. So the pair of ribs that we have in the thoracic region, they are 12 in number. So we have 12 ribs, 12 pairs of ribs, and the sternum, which forms the rib cage, forming the rib cage. So it is this pair of the ribs, these 12 pairs, that is 12 on either side. On the right we have 12, on the left we have 12, and then they articulate to the front of the body where they attach themselves to the sternum using some cartilages. They are attached to the sternum with the help of some cartilages, and that attachment is seen on the sternum. So that is what forms the rib cage. In humans, like we said, the sternum is a single bone, while that in rabbit consists of 7 small bones. The bone of the sternum, or the sternum in man, is just a single bone, a single plate bone, while in the rabbit it consists of 7 small bones, and the ribs articulate with the thoracic vertebrae at the back and curve to the front to attach by means of elastic cartilage. So this is what I am saying in essence here, that in the front region here, if you look closely, what we have here is what we refer to as the sternum. Now, this sternum here is what we have in this part here. This part that is labeled the body. You can see it's sternum, the manubrium and the body. This is it here. This part here. That is where we have the sternum. So if you look closely, you notice that there is something curving to the front here from the back. It is curving from the back and it is coming to the front. Now, if you look at this part here, this part where my pointer is, that is where you notice that this part, the color of this part is different from the color of this part. Good. Now, this part here, they are the ribs. These ones here, they form the ribs. So from this place here to the sternum, that is where we have the cartilages. All of these parts here, they are the cartilages. So the ribs come from the vertebral column. If you look at it from the back, we have a total of 12, including these ones here on the last this dorsal part of the thoracic region. You can see T11, T12. So those are the last two thoracic bones, the thoracic vertebrae, giving out the ribs. So the first 10 form what we refer to as the true ribs, because they actually have attachment to the sternum. While the last two, if you look at this T12 here, that one is very clear. The T12 is not attached to the sternum. It is here hanging on its own on either side. So that is why we refer to that particular bone, or the last two, that's T11 and T12, we refer to them as floating ribs. So what I'm saying in essence is the ribs, all of the thoracic ribs, come from the thoracic region on the vertebral column, and then they articulate with the sternum. Particularly the first 10, they articulate with the sternum, while the last two are floating. So that is what that particular thing is about. So the function of the, okay, I said the first 10, the first 10 ribs, articulate with the sternum, and they are called the true ribs. They are called the true ribs. That's the first 10. They are referred to as the true ribs. While the last two, ribs do not attach themselves. They don't attach themselves with the sternum. Hence, they are free. So they are called false ribs or floating ribs. So that is what we call them, because they do not attach themselves to the sternum. The last two bones, they do not attach themselves to the sternum. They are then called the false ribs or the floating ribs, unlike the first 10 that are called the true ribs. That is what you can see here. You can see it right here, that the first 10, they attach themselves to the sternum. The first 10, that is starting from here, where we have T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, T6, T7, T8, T9, and T10. All of these ones attach themselves to the sternum. Unlike the last two, which is T11 and T12, they do not attach themselves to the sternum, so they are referred to as the floating ribs. So that is about the ribs. So the functions now, functions of the ribs. Functions of the ribs. Functions of the ribs. 1. The first function is that the rib protects the heart, protects internal organs, protects internal organs, e.g., the heart, the lungs, the liver, etc. So that is one of the functions of the rib cage. And then the second function is the fact that its movement, the upward and downward movement. The upward and downward movement of the ribs help in breathing. That is what brings about the ability to breathe in and out the air that we breathe in, because of the continuous decrease and increase in the chest cavity. So those are the functions of the rib. Those are the two major functions of the rib cage, or of the ribs. The two major functions of the ribs. So we have said that the first one is the ability to protect internal organs, while the second one is the ability to what? Bring about upward and downward movement that causes the chest cavity or the thoracic cavity to increase and decrease simultaneously or consecutively, to give us the ability to breathe. So that is about the rib cage. So the next thing we'll be talking about is going to be the appendicular skeleton. We have successfully discussed the axial skeleton. We've talked about the skull. We've talked about the vertebral column. We've also talked about the ribs that articulate with the backbone to form the rib cage. So those are the parts that make up the axial skeleton. So now we'll be talking about the appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton. So that is what we want to talk about now. So what makes up the appendicular skeleton? Like we have said previously, the appendicular skeleton is other parts of the body that are not in the skull, the vertebral column, as well as the ribs. So they make up the pectoral and the pelvic girdle. So if you look at this diagram here, we have this part labeled pink, showing the appendicular skeleton. So we can see the upper limbs here. These are the appendicular skeleton, the upper limbs, the two forelimbs, and then we have the pelvic. The pelvic here, that's the hip bone, as well as the lower limbs. So those are the parts that make up the appendicular skeleton. So in the appendicular skeleton, the first thing we'll be looking at is the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle. Pectoral girdle. That is the first thing we will be looking at. The pectoral girdle. So what does this entail? What is in the pectoral girdle? When we talk about the pectoral girdle, we're talking about the four limbs, and it consists of the following. One, we have the shoulder blade. The shoulder blade. The shoulder blade is also called the scapula. The shoulder blade is also called the scapula. Two, it has the clavicle, or let me say this, the collarbone. The collarbone, which is also called the clavicle. Three, we have, this one is found, the shoulder blade is found on the dorsal side, while this one is found on the anterior position. So they have the third one. We have the third one, which is the coracoid process. The coracoid process, which forms the projection of the scapula. So these are the parts that are found in the pectoral girdle. So this is what we are talking about. This part here, this part of the shoulder, where we have this bone in this long bone in the front here, is called the clavicle. The one that is flat at the back of these ribs here is called the scapula. That's the shoulder blade. And then this point here, this point of attachment of the clavicle, the shoulder blade, and the upper arm is where we have the coracoid process. So that is what we're talking about in the pectoral girdle. Are we together? And then we have the limbs. We have the limbs in that part of the arm. And then the second girdle we'll be talking about, we have the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle. When we finish discussing the girdles, then we'll go to talk about the limbs. So the pelvic girdle, like we have for the pectoral girdle, this also has its own bones that bring about its formation. It consists of some bones as well. The first one there will be having, okay, this particular one has the fusion of three bones. We have the anterior pubis, the anterior pubis. 2, we have the posterior ischium. The posterior ischium, the anterior pubis, the posterior ischium, and the third one is the obturator foramen. The obturator foramen. So these are the parts of the bones that make up the sacral girdle, or we call it the pelvic girdle. So the obturator foramen is a hole that is found between the pubis and the ischium. It's a hole that is found between the pubis and the ischium. So now between the left and the right halves of the girdle is a joint. Between the left and the right halves of the girdle is a joint. Look at this. This particular joint here, this one here, this joint here, in the middle here, this particular one that my pointer is underneath, is what we refer to as we call it the pubic symphysis. That is the joint between the left and the right halves of the pelvic girdle. Between the left and the right hand halves of the pelvic girdle is what we refer to as the pubic symphysis. And then, okay, let's quickly say that the pubic symphysis, the left and the right halves, note, the two halves, left and right, of the pelvic girdle are joined together. They are joined together at the pubic symphysis. At the pubic symphysis. That is the name of that very part where we find the joints of the two halves of the pelvic girdle. And then the head of the limbs, the head of the hind limb, that is the bone of the leg, that is the femur. The head of the hind limb remember that is a ball and a socket joint, so it fits into a hollow called the acetabulum. It fits into a hollow called the acetabulum. That is the name of that hollow where the head of the femur fits into. It is called the acetabulum. So that is what we have for the pelvic and the pectoral girdle. So we have discussed the components of the pectoral girdle. We said the components of the pectoral girdle, we have number 1, the shoulder blade, which is the scapula that is found dorsally, the collarbone, which is found anteriorly, collarbone is also called clavicle, and then we have the coracoid process. And for the pelvic girdle, we have the anterior pubis, the posterior ischium, as well as the obturator foramen. And we talked about the pubic symphysis as the joint between the right and the left halves of the girdle, and then the part of joint or the head of the limb, the head of the hind limb that fits into the hollow called the acetabulum. So lastly, let us quickly discuss what the limbs are. The limbs now. The limb bones. The limbs. The limb bones. So in the limbs, we will talk about the forelimb first. The forelimbs, well, all of the limbs have a kind of structure that we refer to as the pentadactyl pattern. The limbs possess a pentadactyl pattern, and that is why it is found to be fitted into 5 bones or fingers, as the case might be. So pentadactyl, they're talking about 5. It has 5, that is 5 digits. 5 digits. So on the hands we have 5 fingers, on the legs we have 5 toes. So for the forelimb now, the forelimb, that is the upper arm, the upper, or let me say the arms generally, the upper and lower arms. So there we have the humerus. The humerus is the first bone. The long bone is called the humerus. And then it articulates with the scapula. This is the bone that we're talking about here. This particular bone here, this long one here, you can see it fitting into the coracoid process of the shoulder of the pectoral girdle. The humerus is fitting into the pectoral girdle. So this long bone here, this particular bone is what I'm talking about. This long bone here is the humerus, and it fits into the pectoral girdle and the coracoid process. So upper arm here we have the humerus, followed by 2 bones underneath it, which are the ulna and the radius. Underneath the humerus we have the ulna and the radius. That is what we have after the humerus. So ulna and radius, they're followed by the ulna and the radius, and then under the ulna and the radius we now have under the ulna and the radius we have the carpals, which form the wrist bones. The carpals, which forms the wrist bones. The carpals that form the wrist bones, and then we have the metacarpals. We have the metacarpals forming the palms, the palm bones, and lastly we have the phalanges. We have the phalanges that forms the fingers. So that is what we have for the upper limb. And then for the hind limb now, the hind limbs, we have something similar to that. First we have the femur. We have the femur. 2, we have underneath the femur we have the tibia and the fibula. Tibia and fibula. Tibia and fibula. 3. We have the tarsals now. Tarsals. We have the tarsals underneath the tibia and the fibula. Tarsals. These tarsals form the ankle bones, forming the ankle bones. And then underneath that we have the metatarsals. The metatarsals that form the bones of the leg, forming the bones of the feet. The bones of the feet. And lastly, let me just put that here, the 5th, we have the phalanges as well, that actually form the toes. So these are the components of the limbs. So as far as we have come, we've talked about the axial skeleton as well as the appendicular skeleton. So please, you are very free to drop your questions, your comments after going through the notes. Thank you very much. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We appreciate you. Thank you and God bless.